we're going to find increased applicability in cardiac arrest for piston-driven devices or for band-driven devices. This might be one of those things where, all right, maybe now we have some use, some applicability of this device as far as physiology is concerned. Hey, Journal Clubbers, another Magic Monday here on the Overrun. Ed Bowder and Dan Schwester. And today we're going to talk about a new article that's come out. And I want to give a shout out to Jimmy Apple, EMS Avenger, for pointing this out on TikTok, because this study is brand spanking new. It's still hot off the presses. It was accepted by Resuscitation in this month on the 7th of July. So here's the new guy that we're going to be talking about. Right now, there's some interesting data that we have about CPR devices, and this device looked at how effective a Lucas device would be as it pertains to arterial blood pressures. Okay. So this study, all right. So the first problem with Lucas devices is all CPR devices don't work. They do work in that they function, but they don't actually improve outcomes. That hasn't been borne out in the data just yet. So with this study, this is coming out of Norway, and this is looking at what the actual arterial pressure was in patients who had been cannulated arterially during cardiac arrest. And specifically, they wanted to see what kind of changes there were in the pauses in CPR. So Dan, this paper is kind of long. It's a newer thing. It's obviously very wordy because it's a scientific paper. Here we see what the pauses are in cardiac arrest and what it does to the invasive arterial blood pressure. And then here we see the actual phases of CPR, and that's a really cool graphic. The important things to point out, and Lord knows I don't want to bury the lead here, is that while some of the results in this study may have seemed positive, this study was written entirely by people who were either employed by or funded by Stryker, the company that owns the Lucas 2 device and manufactures it. So that's my first hesitation whenever I see any data. I want to make sure that the manufacturer didn't pay for a study to be made. But what do we think here, Dan?
Well, there's some good things to take from this. First of all, this is a human study. This is not a study on pig models or animal models that may or may not have relevance to our world and our bodies. The sample size in the end turns out to be pretty small. 56 individuals with a total of something over 300 pauses were analyzed. Not terrible, but maybe a little bit of an argument that it's underpowered. I wait to see when this comes out to see what a lot of people are saying.
I think that's valid. I think, and I understand that they were looking at more than 200 patients when they started actually breaking down the study. 56 is not a terrible N, but I mean, I would really like to see more patients included before we say, 56 patients represents a diaspora.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing here is that in Norway, they have anesthesiologist trained rapid response units that go to cardiac arrest, so that one of the things that they can do is place arterial lines, which is, I like this because it's a lot more accurate compression by compression to measure what the flow is and to maybe be able to extrapolate that back towards central circulation. Much better than an NIBP or anything else we'd be using in the field right now. The problems is that A-lines are not something that are widely placed in the field. They can be problematic. They had some trouble, especially at the radial site, putting in a lot of lines and not a lot of lines, and a little bit more with femoral lines. But again, it's a complicated process. It can be difficult. It's not like popping in a peripheral IV. That could have affected the results here and could have played with the data a little bit.
And yeah, I mean, one of the things with this study, and again, one of the most important things in any data set is how was the data actually gathered? And again, here, this is all in hospital, which is always kind of a red flag for us. It was done, again, ideal settings. You've got anesthesiologists that are coming down. I do like that they show how they actually measured the arterial blood pressure. They use mathematics on top of actually using the machine itself.
Right.
Something that is interesting, and I worry that this is going to be interpreted as a cardiac arrest study, which technically these were patients that were in cardiac arrest that were being studied. But what this really shows, I think, is that an automated device, whether it's a Lucas or whatever, the Lucas is what was analyzed in this study, is it does improve, at least theoretically, end organ and cerebral circulation in CPR. Right. So
I agree with that.
Yeah. So for years, we've been having this argument, and certainly anyone who's seen me in the field will hear me make this argument that, we're carrying around this 35-pound paperweight that looks good, but doesn't necessarily improve outcomes. And how many times, Danny, have you and I walked on scene and we hear like the vuchi, 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 vuchi of the Lucas device, and we're like, oh, we already know what's going to happen with this. So while personally, I don't think that we're going to find increased applicability in cardiac arrest for piston-driven devices or for band-driven devices, this might be one of those things where, all right, maybe now we have some use, some applicability of this device as far as physiology is concerned, right? Because there's always things like, oh, well, we can use these for crew resource management. We can use this for, we don't have enough people. It acts as an extra rescuer. You always hear people will say like, oh, well, the Lucas device doesn't get tired, which is true and important to think of. But if it can improve outcomes, at least maybe this is a step toward improving the patient in the field. And then maybe, it's a combination of pressors and early CPR and early oxygenation and early defibrillation. So it might be that these devices are more useful as just kind of a tool in the toolbox, and not so much that it's, the end all be all for cardiac arrest care. So what we mentioned earlier in this, and so here's the flow sheet of how the patients were actually recruited for this study. You had 722 that were out of hospital cardiac arrest, 221 met the enrollment criteria. They gave informed consent. They cannulated 95% of the patients, which again, just so we're clear on this, the patients that were included in this cohort, it amounts to about, and this is just paper napkin math, like 80%, 85% of patients that were eligible for the study weren't enrolled because they couldn't be cannulated. Right. And then after they're cannulated, we had to find who had pauses done in CPR. So now this possible N of 722 is dropping down to 56. And that's not bad, right? You want to have a good cohort in the actual study. My worry is that when we talk about it being underpowered with 56 people, it's possible that maybe the wrong patients were excluded, or this paper is so hyper specific that it only works for a certain cohort of patients, which again, I have no problem with. But I worry that, again, papers like this are going to go out into media and into the EMS world, and it's going to be like, well, did you hear that actually the Lucas device works and it does save lives and all this? And the data just doesn't support that. But in this setting, it might be, all right, so if the idea is to get increased cerebral perfusion, increased circulation, maybe a Lucas device may be superior to something like an auto pulse. And we received no funding from either Stryker or from Zoll. Although I'm not opposed to it if any of y'all are listening and want to just send a bag of money our way. But I do want to focus on the limitations here, because I think this is what's important. One of the comments that I made on social media was, it mentions here where all the authors work, and the comment was, and the crowd goes wild. It seems like there's always statements where like, oh, we have this great study, it's based on good information and good data, and now we've made this big change. And it turns out that it was done because the company that it benefited contributed financially to making this study be good. And that's not the most eloquent way to put it, but it seems to be a common thread in a lot of these data sets that come out about automated CPR devices. Stryker and Zoll are enormous healthcare organizations or corporations that have money to put into their research and money to put into all of their treatments. So they're able to make studies that say, our study says this, right? But if you're ever reading data, the first thing that should stick out in your head is who is responsible for this data, right? If I own a company that gives, like, how you see like the electrolyte water and like, all that stuff. If I tell you like, oh, well, studies show that being alkalotic actually improves recovery. Okay, that might be true. But if I'm drinking alkaline water and putting it into an acidic stomach, none of it actually matters. So I worry this is one of those studies that's like, here's really interesting stuff, but it doesn't actually change anything. So just to be clear on this declaration of competing interests, it says the authors declare the following financial interests, and it lists everyone that you can see here on the screen either works for or received funding from Stryker, as I said at the top of the show. Again, big red flag for me that the owners or the people who are writing the paper are actively involved and have a financial interest in this data. That's kind of my big hang up on it. Aside from that, I don't know how usable this data is, but what do we think on that, Tim?
Well, I'm not going to throw this thing out and say it's garbage right away. I think there's some good data in it. I'm kind of torn on automated CPR devices. I think there is a strong utility for them. I know that the data has pretty much not proven that it's any better than mechanical than human CPR or manual CPR. The idea that the authors of this paper get financial compensation from the company that makes the device, I'm a little bit more, my eyes are a little bit more open for bias per se, because it's not going to be, what if my question is, what if they got negative results? Would this paper have been published? I don't know.
And that's one of the hangups of having that financial interest, right? Where, and there's bias in data one way or the other, right?
Sure.
If you have, if you're working for a hospital organization and they want to show, whatever, our resuscitation numbers exceed our competitor, if they decide to go through with that study and the study doesn't reflect what they want it to reflect, they're probably not going to release that data. Yeah. So, the fact that this was released is encouraging because at least they took the time to think about it and they took the time to observe it. So I want to give Rosie and her team a lot of credit for exploring this.
Yeah, I think I think it was a very interesting methodology. It did bring up some interesting data, and it kind of turned the idea of that slow, gradual rise in perfusion pressure when we've had pauses for compressions, kind of threw it on its ear a little bit and said, no, that doesn't really happen. And unfortunately, this is one of the problems that we see with CPR and resuscitation studies, right? Is that we don't really have the ability to truly replicate the quote unquote, average cardiac arrest. There are so many different factors. There's so many different variables that you have to account for in an individual cardiac arrest. I don't know that we can study this effectively. I don't know how we can measure cerebral perfusion pressure in a patient in cardiac arrest with CPR. I don't know how we can randomize it to manual CPR, mechanical CPR, whatever. I think it goes back to, again, you always love to say we don't know what we're doing in cardiac arrest, and I think this paper continues to bear that out. We really aren't sure, and we don't really have a good model to work on. Maybe in the future, AI or some kind of computerized model is going to do better work for us on this, because the data, quite frankly, is all over the place.
And as far as cerebral perfusion is concerned, I mean, you're right. It is very difficult to get that data. And realistically, right, what kind of study would you want to see, or would I want to see that would, give the answers that I'm interested in, right? So we know that studies are difficult to actually get done. I think something like 70% or 80% of studies that are started don't get finished. I am making that number up. Do not quote me on that. But for what it's worth, how many academic ideas of, hey, we should research this turn into like, it didn't really go where we want. But something I do want to point out in this paper that is, again, it's another kind of red flag thing for me. I don't like when studies speak in absolutes. And not because I think that the people that write the study are Sith, but I do think that, nothing for the Star Wars joke. All right, fine. But I do think that here in the conclusions, it says ABP generated by mechanical CPR recovers quickly after pauses. Pause duration is not related to post-pause blood pressure recovery. Consequently, short pauses, such as pauses for 30 to 2, may pose less hemodynamic concern than previously thought. That isn't what the paper showed. Again, we've talked on Journal Club previously where, the best end line in any article or in any journal piece is, there further study is needed, further data is needed, because we see this, it's interesting, but we just don't know. And This paper, while it was looking at automated devices, it says that, pauses for 30 to 2 may pose less hemodynamic concern than previously thought. Okay, but that's not what the Lucas device does, right? It's studying something that humans do, the 30 to 2, whereas once you put a Lucas device on the patient, it can offer continuous compressions. So again, we have this information that's interesting, but it's a little bit conflicting with the data, because this paper is studying the effect of pauses on CPR, which is something that has been largely taken out of CPR, at least practically, for 5 years. So do we put these devices on and continue to run them throughout the arrest because that's how they're designed and that's what we've been told to do? Or is it more effective if we do 30 to 2? And if we do 30 to 2, is it only effective in those 54 or 56 patients that were in this data set? Right. And again, this is a different country. This is a different type of thing. I think it's a good idea in hospital to have an anesthesia team that can get ready to work an arrest. There should be, we're going to talk about bundled ER packages in another journal club where, having that group, having that team there to really help facilitate things, I think is vitally important. But now it's, aside from that, the extant data that CPR devices don't improve outcomes, we have this kind of, conflating factor where, all right, maybe it doesn't improve outcomes, but it does improve perfusion as far as the arteries are concerned. Okay, that's terrific. Maybe there's a reality that exists. And again, other studies may build off of this, where it might be preferable to use a device like this and then introduce, say, pressors, right? Maybe using an alpha drug or using something like that might increase cerebral perfusion. So then it kind of, it mitigates the need for a Lucas device. But I'm just not convinced that this shows this. So give me what are your final thoughts on this, Danny? I'm not convinced, for me, that this is practice changing, because I don't know what practice it would change. But I want to hear your thoughts, and then I'll do my final thing. We'll get out of here.
I think it's interesting. I think it goes back to the idea that we need to decide, what do we want CPR and resuscitation to actually be? And that goes from, I think we're dancing around the issue here. The issue is there's tons of things we can study, but we still don't know who to select for the procedure. We don't know who has the best chance of outcome for the procedure. We think younger people, obviously more cardiac arrhythmias, things like that, obviously do better than your later stage cardiac arrest patients. I don't think that there's going to be one reliable thing that comes out and says, do this because this is going guaranteed to work and here's the data. I think that there are people that probably do CPR excellently, and there are teams that can do it effectively and maintain a good perfusion pressure and do everything the way we expect it to and follow the recommendations, and they can get good outcomes. I think people who are well versed in using a mechanical device, if they can apply it effectively and put it on, I think they can, and use it effectively, I think you can get good results. It's just like ventilators, right? You can bag somebody. There are people that can bag people just really, really well. And there are people that can run ventilators very, very well. Over the long term, my personal feeling, I think the mechanical devices are probably going to be the better choice in the long run, because I think you get consistency. And I think you, just like with a ventilator, you get consistency. You get the same thing pretty much every time, as long as you're paying attention to it. Now, that being said, we have to train that way, and we have to think that way, and we have to start maybe looking at what is definitive care for cardiac arrest. And I think the answer's on the horizon, and it's going to be something like ECMO, guys. It's not going to be where we're going to be. It's not going to be the 98-year-old in a nursing home. It's going to be somebody who's viable, who is a witness arrest. These are people that are reversible, people we can fix. They're going to go on pump. They're going to go to a cardiac arrest center, and we're going to get good outcomes, just like the data that we've shown in those studies. So we're still reaching, we're still trying to figure out what's going on. And yeah, it's just stay tuned. I mean, this is something interesting, but it doesn't change practice.
No, and I think that's pretty close to right. I think that in a setting where, if we had, perfect world, right? we have a Lucas that works. We have VV ECMO that we can apply in the field. You know, we have cooling if you're really feeling frisky, depending on which data set you want to read. You know, we have good airway management, all that kind of stuff. In a perfect storm type of scenario, I think this is helpful. Just having that knowledge where, you know, maybe if you're in a setting and you're not doing effective hands-on CPR for whatever reason, if it could just be that hands-on CPR is hard to do. And you want to maybe give the patient a better chance and increase their perfusion. Okay, yeah, I see an automated device fitting into that algorithm. And if we have something where, you know, all right, now we're going to do VV ECMO on these patients, which is probably the fastest way to do it pre-hospitally. Okay, great. Now we have a device where that can temporize the patient until we get the VV ECMO set up. And I'm willing to accept that type of situation for a Lucas device. The problem, again, right now, it's not super applicable. And
we're not there yet.
Yeah. And so it might be in, you know, 5 years, 10 years, we get to a point where, you know, we're using these devices, we're using ECMO, we're doing you know, but I mean, at this point, we've been arguing for, you know, ambulances to get whole blood for a decade. So, you know, I worry that this data set comes out, people are going to misinterpret it, and then it's going to turn out to be, you know, oh, this is the greatest cardiac arrest thing we've read in a long time, which is just not the case. But really interesting study. We want to know what you guys think. Thanks for watching the Journal Club. Check it out. Subscribe down below. Be sure you click the button that comes onto the screen. We are here, well, I mean, most Mondays. I would say every Monday, but that's just a lie. So, but thanks for watching on Magic Monday, everybody. I'm Ed Bowder. He's Dan Schwester, and we'll see you all next week.
Take care.